What if I told you that the most festive time of the year used to be the spookiest? Long before stockings were hung by the chimney with care, families would gather in the dark of Christmas Eve to tell ghost stories. It sounds strange, doesn't it? Especially after a century of non-stop sleigh bells and sentimental cheer. We associate ghosts with Halloween, with autumn leaves and jack-o'-lanterns. But for hundreds of years, the deepest, darkest part of winter wasn't for Santa Claus, it was for specters. Christmas was the time for spirits, and not just the kind you drink. This is the story of a lost tradition, a tradition of gathering around a crackling fire on the longest nights of the year to share tales of the supernatural. We'll look at how this all started in the frozen wilderness of pagan Europe, travel through the gaslit parlors of Victorian England, and finally get to our own time to ask the question, why did we stop telling ghost stories on Christmas? And is it time to bring them back? Before we get into the spooky stuff, let's first picture the Christmas we all know. Close your eyes and think of it. What comes to mind? Probably a swirl of twinkling lights on pine trees, the smell of cinnamon and gingerbread, the sound of crinkling wrapping paper, a distant jingle of a sleigh bell, and the never-ending loop of cheerful carols promising peace on earth. It's a holiday that has been polished to a high sheen of wholesomeness. Its main character is a jolly, red-suited old man who brings presents to good kids. The focus is all on family, food, and warm, fuzzy feelings. It's a season of brightness, warmth, and childhood innocence. The modern Christmas is a carefully managed experience, a global brand of cozy comfort that's designed to keep the darkness out. We watch feel-good movies, we build gingerbread houses. The whole month of December feels like one big attempt to create a bubble of perfect, sanitized happiness. It's a holiday that has been thoroughly tamed. There's little room for anything complicated, and definitely no room for the macabre. The very idea of dropping a scary ghost into this cheerful landscape feels wrong, almost shocking. It's like finding a skull in your stocking. And yet, a ghost of the tradition itself is hiding in plain sight. Every year we hear Andy Williams sing about scary ghost stories and tales of the glories of Christmases long, long ago. For most of us, that line is a charming but weird little fossil from a time we can't really imagine. We might chuckle at it, but we don't stop to ask why. Why would anyone want to tell a scary story at the most wonderful time of the year? To answer that, we have to turn down the bright electric lights of our modern Christmas and travel back in time to an era when the nights were much longer, much darker, and when the spirit world was believed to be closer than ever. Our first stop, the golden age of the Christmas ghost story, Victorian England. Picture Christmas Eve in the mid-1800s. The world is being transformed by the fire and smoke of the Industrial Revolution. Cities like London are exploding in size, wrapped in a permanent fog of coal smoke. But inside the parlors of the growing middle class, a different kind of fire is burning. Families are gathered around the hearth, and with the long, cold night ahead of them, they needed some entertainment, and what they craved was a good scare. This was when telling ghost stories at Christmas became a beloved cultural ritual. It was so popular that in 1891, writer Jerome K. Jerome remarked, "Whenever 5 or 6 English-speaking people meet round a fire on Christmas Eve, they start telling each other ghost stories. It's a genial, festive season, and we love to muse upon graves and dead bodies and murders and blood." This wasn't some niche hobby. For many, it was a cherished part of the Christmas festivities. And the undisputed king of this tradition was Charles Dickens. Today, we remember him for basically creating the blueprint of the sentimental Christmas with his 1843 novella, A Christmas Carol. But we often forget its full title, A Christmas Carol,
in prose, being a ghost story of Christmas. When Dickens published it, he wasn't inventing something new. He was tapping into and turbocharging a tradition that had existed for centuries but was starting to fade. A Christmas Carol was a massive hit, and it cemented the link between Christmas and ghosts for generations. The story of Ebenezer Scrooge is the perfect Christmas ghost story. His haunting by Jacob Marley and the Three Spirits is a brilliant mix of frights and morality. The ghosts are there for a reason, to force Scrooge to face his past, present, and future, and to spark a moral transformation. Marley's ghost, dragging a chain made of cash boxes and ledgers, wasn't just a spooky special effect. It was a powerful symbol of a life wasted on greed, a theme that really hit home for the Victorians. But Dickens wasn't his first go at festive frights. In his 1836 novel, The Pickwick Papers, he included a tale called The Story of the Goblins Who Stole a Sexton. It's about a grumpy gravedigger who, on Christmas Eve, gets kidnapped by goblins and is shown visions that turn him into a better person. Sound familiar? Dickens knew his audience. With more people learning to read and steam-powered presses making books and magazines cheaper, a huge new reading public was hungry for stories. As editor of popular magazines like Household Words and All the Year Round, Dickens made a point to publish special Christmas numbers. These issues were packed with supernatural tales and sold like crazy. He didn't just write his own, he hired the best authors of his day, like Elizabeth Gaskell and Wilkie Collins, turning the Christmas ghost story into its own literary genre. One of Dickens's own later stories, The Signal Man from 1866, is a masterpiece of psychological horror about a railway worker haunted by a specter that predicts disasters. It's a story without a neat moral, leaving just a pure, chilling feeling of dread. This obsession wasn't just in books. The Victorian era was a time of amazing scientific discovery, but that progress existed right alongside a huge fascination with spiritualism, mesmerism, and the occult. Seances were a popular pastime, and people were seriously grappling with questions about life after death. Christmas ghost stories gave them a safe, communal way to explore these anxieties. They were a kind of fireside philosophy, a way to think about life and death, wrapped up in a thrilling package. The tradition became so popular that other literary giants got in on it. M.R. James, a Cambridge scholar, started a personal tradition in the 1880s of writing a new ghost story every year to read aloud to his friends on Christmas Eve. His tales were subtle, smart, and deeply scary. Henry James's terrifying novella, The Turn of the Screw, is famously set up as a story being told to a group gathered around a fire on Christmas Eve. So the Victorian Christmas was way more complex than ours. It was a holiday of sharp contrasts, the warmth of the fire against the bitter cold, the joy of the season against the contemplation of death, the bright promise of Christian belief against the dark pull of ancient superstition. To understand where that darker pull came from, we have to go back much, much further, to a time before Christmas even had a name.
Long before the first Christmas carol was ever sung, the middle of winter was a time of deep primal fear. For ancient peoples in northern Europe, the winter solstice, around December 21st, marked the longest, darkest night of the year. It was a huge cosmic event, the death of the sun, and the anxious wait for it to be reborn. This was a world lit only by fire. When the sun vanished, the darkness was total, and it was filled with unseen terrors. This period had many names. The Romans celebrated Saturnalia, a week-long party of feasting and role reversal. Germanic and Norse peoples celebrated Yule, a festival to honor the dead and plead for the sun's return. These pagan festivals were built on a core belief. During the longest nights of the year, the boundary between the world of the living and the world of spirits was especially active. It was a time when the dead could walk the earth. This wasn't a metaphor, it was a deeply held belief.
Folklore from this era is full of horrors. In Scandinavia, people told stories of the Draugr, risen corpses that would stalk out of their burial mounds to terrorize villages. In Germanic folklore, there was the Wild Hunt, a terrifying, ghostly procession of hunters and hounds that would tear across the winter sky, led by gods like Odin. Seeing the Wild Hunt was an omen of death or disaster. In this world, storytelling wasn't just entertainment, it was a survival tool. Families would huddle around the hearth, the light of the Yule log their only defense against the oppressive dark. They told stories to pass the long, scary hours. They told stories to explain the strange noises the wind made. They told stories of ghosts and monsters to give a name to their fears, and by doing so, feel some control over them. This tradition of winter tales is incredibly ancient. In the Old English epic Beowulf, which is thought to be a classic winter's tale, the monster Grendel attacks from the darkness and the cold. The practice was still common centuries later. Shakespeare mentions it in his play The Winter's Tale, when a young prince says, "A sad tale's best for winter. I have one of sprites and goblins." In 1725, the English folklorist Henry Bourne noted that rural families often spent winter evenings around the fire telling stories of apparitions and ghosts. When the Victorians gathered around their fires, they weren't starting something new. They were taking part in the final brilliant chapter of a tradition that was thousands of years old, a ritual born from the basic human fear of the dark. To give you a real taste of that tradition, it's time to dim the lights, lean in a little closer, and listen to a story that would have been told on a night just like this over a century and a half ago. Tonight's story was first published in a Christmas issue of Charles Dickens' magazine, Household Words, in 1852. It was written by the brilliant novelist Elizabeth Gaskell and is called The Old Nurse's Story. It's told by an old nurse, Hester, who is looking back on the strange events of a winter long ago, when her young charge, a little girl named Rosamond, was sent to live in her mother's ancestral home, a remote and ancient manor called Furnival. My story begins many years ago when I was a young woman. My charge was little Miss Rosamond, an orphan whose parents died of a fever when she was only 5. We were sent to live at Furnival Manor, deep in the hills of Northumberland. It was a grand gray stone house, as old and silent as the hills themselves. The mistress of the house was the elderly Miss Furnival, a woman whose face looked like it was carved from stone, and whose heart seemed just as cold. From the moment we arrived, a chill settled on us that had nothing to do with the weather. The house was huge, with long dark halls and rooms covered in dust sheets like sleeping giants. Rosamond was a cheerful child, but even her laughter seemed to vanish in the heavy quiet of that place. The only others living there were a few old servants who moved like ghosts themselves, always whispering and casting fearful looks at the east wing that was kept locked and empty.
The strangeness started small, a faint sound late at night that Rosamond said was a little girl crying. I told her it was just the wind. Then she started to hear music, a faint, ghostly tune from an organ, drifting from the sealed-off east wing. I heard it too, but when I asked the old servant Dorothy about it, her face went pale, and she begged me not to mention it. One afternoon, in the dead of winter, the first snow began to fall. Rosamond came running to me from the garden, her eyes wide with excitement. "Hester," she cried, "there is a little girl out there, in the snow. She's so cold, she has no cloak on. She wants me to come play." I looked out the window, but saw only swirling snowflakes.
I scolded Rosamond for making up stories, but a seed of unease took root in my heart. A few days later, I saw her myself. It was getting dark, and I was looking out from the nursery window. There, by a grove of bare holly trees, stood the figure of a small child. She was facing away from me, dressed in old-fashioned clothes. She raised a small arm and seemed to be beckoning toward the house. A cold dread crept over me. That night I cornered Dorothy, the oldest servant, and demanded she tell me the house's story. Trembling, she finally told me everything. She said the organ was played by the ghost of the old lord, Miss Furnivall's father. He had 2 daughters, Maud and Grace, our mistress. Both sisters fell in love with a foreign musician their father had hired. Maud secretly married him and had a child, a little girl, whom she kept hidden in the east wing. Grace, eaten up by jealousy, discovered the secret and told their father. The old lord, a man of terrible pride and rage, was furious. On a brutal winter's night, just like this one, he dragged Maud and her little girl from their rooms. He struck the child and threw them both out into a blizzard. All the while, Grace, our Miss Furnivall, sat at the organ in the great hall, playing loudly to drown out her sister's desperate pleas and the child's cries. Maud was found the next day, driven mad with grief, holding the frozen body of her daughter. She died soon after, and ever since, on the anniversary of that night, the ghosts of the past returned to reenact their terrible tragedy. The little girl's spirit, forever cold, would come back, looking for a playmate to join her in the snow. As Dorothy finished, a terrible scream came downstairs. We rushed down to find Rosamond, who was supposed to be in bed, standing at the great oak door, pounding on it with her little hands. "Let me out! My little girl is out there! She's crying for me!" Her face was flushed, her eyes wild. Through the door we could hear the faint, sad cry of a child calling Rosamond's name. Dorothy's face was a mask of pure terror. We bolted the door and carried the sobbing Rosamond back upstairs, but as we passed the great hall, we all froze. The air had grown deathly cold. A dim, ghostly light came from the hall, and there, at the great organ, was the translucent figure of an old man with a cruel face, the ghost of the long-dead lord. Before him stood the phantom of the little girl, shivering in her ragged clothes, and between them stood another figure, the phantom of the younger Lord Furnivall, raising his crutch to strike the child. Suddenly, our own Miss Furnivall appeared at the top of the stairs. She saw the spectral scene below, the replay of her own youthful crime. A terrible cry was torn from her. "Oh, heaven, forgive me!" she shrieked, stumbling down the stairs. "Stop! Do not strike the child!" But as she reached the bottom, another phantom appeared. It was the phantom of her younger self, watching the horrible act with a cruel smile. At the sight of her own unforgiving past, the real Miss Furnivall collapsed. We carried her to bed. She lingered for a few days, facing the wall, muttering the same dreadful words, "What is done in youth can never be undone in age." She died, and Rosamond and I left that haunted place, never to return. But sometimes, even now, on the coldest winter nights, I think I can hear the faint, sad notes of a phantom organ on the wind. Gaskell's story is a perfect example of the Victorian tradition, a spooky tale of supernatural revenge built around a moral lesson. For decades, stories like this were all the rage. But as the 19th century turned into the 20th, the ghosts of Christmas began to disappear. The tradition that had lasted for thousands of years slowly faded thanks to a mix of social, cultural, and technological changes. One of the main culprits was the very success of the Christmas that Dickens himself had helped popularize. The takeaway from A Christmas Carol wasn't the terror of the ghosts, but the warmth of Scrooge's redemption. Over time, the sentimental, family-focused aspects of the holiday overshadowed its spooky side. Christmas became more commercial and, most importantly, more child-centric. The figure of Santa Claus grew to become the undisputed star of the holiday, pushing the scarier figures from folklore to the side. The focus shifted from thinking about death to celebrating childhood innocence. Ghosts just didn't fit into this new, wholesome Christmas card reality. Then came World War I. A generation of young men went into the trenches and saw horrors far more real than any fictional ghost. When they came back, the public's appetite for recreational terror had faded. For a society dealing with the very real ghosts of millions of dead, fireside tales about imaginary spirits may have seemed silly or even offensive. Technology also played a huge part. The spread of electric lighting literally pushed back the darkness. The long, terrifying winter nights that gave birth to the tradition were now brightly lit.
The shadows where ghosts once hid were gone with the flick of a switch. At the same time, new forms of media, like radio and later television, changed how families entertained themselves. The active tradition of telling stories was replaced by passively watching professionally produced shows. Finally, the ghosts didn't vanish completely, they just moved. As the Christmas ghost story faded in England, another holiday was gaining popularity in America, brought over by Irish and Scottish immigrants, Halloween. This holiday, with its own ancient roots, was also a time when the spirit world was thought to be close. Over the 20th century, Halloween became the designated holiday for all things spooky. It soaked up the ghosts, ghouls, and monsters that Christmas was leaving behind. The holiday roles were now clear. Halloween was for frights, Christmas was for fun. The ghost story, once a proud Christmas tradition, now belonged to Halloween. So, we've gone from the dark, howling wilderness of the winter solstice, where our ancestors huddled around fires telling tales, to the foggy, gaslit streets of Victorian London, where the ghost story was reborn as a Christmas pastime. And we've watched as that tradition dissolved under the bright lights of modernity, its spirits fleeing the overwhelming cheer of commercial Christmas to take up residence in the shadows of Halloween. The question of why we used to tell ghost stories on Christmas has a simple, powerful answer. Because Christmas used to be the darkest time of the year, not just literally, but psychologically. It was a time for reflection, for looking inward as the world outside grew cold and dead. It was a time to acknowledge the thin line between life and death, and to feel the thrill of being alive and safe by the fire while the spirits roamed the frozen earth. The modern Christmas, with its relentless pressure to be cheerful, has maybe lost some of that depth. In getting rid of the ghosts, we might have also lost a vital part of the season's power, its connection to mystery, to memory, and to the great, humbling cycle of darkness and light. But a tradition isn't a fossil, it's a living thing, and it can be brought back. The nights are still long, the wind still howls, and the human need for a good story, for that delicious shiver of fear in a safe place, hasn't gone anywhere. So, this year,
How about we try to revive this lost tradition? When the family is gathered and a quiet moment settles in, light a candle, lower the electric lights, and tell a story. It could be a classic, like the one you heard tonight. It could be a local legend, a family story, or something you make up. Let's summon back the ghosts of Christmas. Let the shadows in, just for a little while. You might find that a little bit of darkness makes the light of Christmas burn all the brighter. What's your favorite ghost story? Share it in the comments below, and let's bring the tradition back to life together.